In Edith Wharton's story Kerfol, published in 1911, a solitary traveller visits an ancient house in Brittany, a place shrouded in silence and mystery. Wandering the grounds, he encounters a pack of strange, silent dogs, their watchful eyes heavy with meaning. But Kerfol is no ordinary house. Its walls seem to echo with an unspoken history, a lingering presence that refuses to be forgotten. What happened within its cold stone walls, and why do the dogs remain?
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies.
Kerfol by Edith Wharton, published 1916. "You ought to buy it," said my host. "It's just the place for a solitary-minded devil like you, and it would be rather worthwhile to own the most romantic house in Brittany. The present people are dead broke, and it's going for a song. You ought to buy it." It was not with the least idea of living up to the character my friend Laran ascribed to me. As a matter of fact, under my unsociable exterior, I have always had secret yearnings for domesticity, that I took his hint one autumn afternoon and went to Kerfol. My friend was motoring over to Quimper on business. He dropped me on the way at a crossroads on a heath and said, "First turn to the right and second to the left, then straight ahead till you see an avenue. If you meet the peasants, don't ask your way. They don't understand French, and they would pretend they did and mix you up. I'll be back for you here by sunset, and don't forget the tombs in the chapel." I followed Laran's directions with a hesitation occasioned by the usual difficulty of remembering whether he had said the first turn to the right and second to the left, or the contrary. If I had met a peasant, I should certainly have asked, and probably been sent astray, but I had the desert landscape to myself, and so stumbled on the right turn and walked across the heath till I came to an avenue. It was so unlike any other avenue I have ever seen that I instantly knew it must be the avenue. The grey-trunked trees sprang up straight to a great height, and then interwove their pale grey branches in a long tunnel through which the autumn light fell faintly. I know most trees by name, but I haven't to this day been able to decide what those trees were. They had the tall curve of elms, the tenuity of poplars, the ashen colour of olives under a rainy sky, and they stretched ahead of me for half a mile or more without a break in their arch. If ever I saw an avenue that unmistakably led to something, it was the avenue at Kerfol. My heart beat a little as I began to walk down it. Presently the trees ended, and I came to a fortified gate and a long wall. Between me and the wall was an open space of grass, with other grey avenues radiating from it. Behind the wall were tall slate roofs mossed with silver, a chapel belfry, the top of a keep. A moat filled with wild shrubs and brambles surrounded the place. The drawbridge had been replaced by a stone arch, and the portcullis by an iron gate. I stood for a long time on the hither side of the moat, gazing about me, and letting the influence of the place sink in. I said to myself, if I wait long enough, the guardian will turn up and show me the tombs, and I rather hoped he wouldn't turn up too soon. I sat down on a stone and lit a cigarette. As soon as I'd done it, it struck me as a puerile and portentous thing to do, with that great blind house looking down at me, and all the empty avenues converging on me. It may have been the depth of the silence that made me so conscious of my gesture. The squeak of my match sounded as loud as the scraping of a brake, and I almost fancied I heard it fall when I tossed it onto the grass. But there was more than that. A sense of irrelevance, of littleness, of futile bravado in sitting there puffing my cigarette smoke into the face of such a past. I knew nothing of the history of Kerfol. I was new to Brittany, and Laran had never mentioned the name to me till the day before, but one couldn't as much glance at the pile without feeling in it a long accumulation of history. What kind of history I was not prepared to guess, Perhaps only that sheer weight of many associated lives and deaths which gives a majesty to all old houses. But the aspect of Kerfol suggested something more, a perspective of stern and cruel memories stretching away like its own grey avenues into a blur of darkness. Certainly no house had ever more completely and finally broken with the present. As it stood there, lifting its proud roofs and gables to the sky, it might have been its own funeral monument. Tombs in the chapel! The whole place is a tomb, I reflected. I hoped more and more that the guardian wouldn't come. The details of the place, however striking, would seem trivial compared with its collective impressiveness, and I wanted only to sit there and be penetrated by the weight of its silence. "It's the very place for you," Laran had said, and I was overcome by the almost blasphemous frivolity of suggesting to any living being that Kerfol was the place for him. Is it possible that anyone could not see? I wondered. I didn't finish the thought. What I meant was undefinable. I stood up and wandered toward the gate. I was beginning to want to know more, not to see more. I was by now so sure it was not a question of seeing, but to feel more. Feel all the place had to communicate. But to get in, one will have to rout out the keeper, I thought reluctantly, and hesitated. Finally, I crossed the bridge and tried the iron gate. It yielded, and I walked through the tunnel formed by the thickness of the chemin de ronde. At the farther end, a wooden barricade had been laid across the entrance, and beyond it was a court enclosed in noble architecture. The main building faced me, and I now saw that one half was a mere ruined front with gaping windows through which the wild growths of the moat and the trees of the park were visible. The rest of the house was still in its robust beauty. One end abutted on the round tower, the other on the small traceried chapel, and in an angle of the building stood a graceful well-head crowned with mossy urns. A few roses grew against the walls, and on an upper window-sill I remember noticing a pot of fuchsias. My sense of the pressure of the invisible began to yield to my architectural interest. The building was so fine that I felt a desire to explore it for its own sake. I looked about the court, wondering in which corner the guardian lodged. Then I pushed open the barrier and went in. As I did so, a dog barred my way. He was such a remarkable, beautiful little dog that for a moment he made me forget the splendid place he was defending. I was not sure of his breed at the time, but I have since learned that it was Chinese, and that he was of a rare variety called the sleeve dog. He was very small and golden brown, with large brown eyes and a ruffled throat. He looked like a large tawny chrysanthemum. I said to myself, these little beasts always snap and scream, and somebody'll be out in a minute. The little animal stood before me, forbidding, almost menacing. There was anger in his large brown eyes, but he made no sound. He came no nearer. Instead, as I advanced, he gradually fell back, and I noticed that another dog, a vague, rough, brindled thing, had limped up on a lame leg. There'll be a hubbub now, I thought, for at the same moment a third dog, a long-haired white mongrel, slipped out of a doorway and joined the others. All three stood looking at me with grave eyes, but not a sound came from them. As I advanced, they continued to fall back on muffled paws, still watching me. At a given point, they'll all charge at my ankles. It's one of the jokes that dogs who live together put up on one, I thought. I was not alarmed, for they were neither large nor formidable, but they let me wander about the court as I pleased, following me at a little distance, always the same distance, and always keeping their eyes on me. Presently I looked across at the ruined facade and saw that in one of its empty window frames another dog stood, a white pointer with one brown ear. He was an old grave dog, much more experienced than the others, and he seemed to be observing me with a deeper intentness. I'll hear from him, I said to myself, but he stood in the window frame, against the trees of the park, and continued to watch me without moving. I stared back at him for a time to see if the sense that he was being watched would not rouse him. Half the width of the court lay between us, and we gazed at each other silently across it. but he didn't stir, and at last I turned away. Behind me I found the rest of the pack, with a newcomer added, a small black greyhound with pale agate-coloured eyes. He was shivering a little, and his expression was more timid than that of the others. I noticed that he kept a little behind them, and still there was not a sound. I stood there for fully 5 minutes, the circle about me, waiting, as they seemed to be waiting. At last I went up to the little golden-brown dog and stooped to pat him. As I did so, I heard myself give a nervous laugh. The little dog did not start, or growl, or take his eyes from me. He simply slipped back about a yard, and then paused and continued to look at me. "Oh, hang it!" I exclaimed, and walked across the court toward the well. As I advanced, the dogs separated and slid away into different corners of the court. I examined the urns on the well, tried a locked door or two, and looked up and down the dumb facade. Then I faced about toward the chapel. When I turned, I perceived that all the dogs had disappeared, except the old pointer, who still watched me from the window. It was rather a relief to be rid of that cloud of witnesses. I began to look about me for a way to the back of the house. Perhaps there'll be somebody in the garden, I thought. I found a way across the moat, scrambled over a wall smothered in brambles, and got into the garden. A few lean hydrangeas and geraniums pined in the flower beds, and the ancient house looked down on them indifferently. Its garden side was plainer and severer than the other. The long granite front, with its few windows and steep roof, looked like a fortress prison. I walked around the farther wing, went up some disjointed steps, and entered the deep twilight of a narrow and incredibly old box walk. The walk was just wide enough for one person to slip through, and its branches met overhead. It was like the ghost of a box walk, its lustrous green all turning to the shadowy greyness of the avenues. I walked on, the branches hitting me in the face and springing back with a dry rattle, and at length I came out onto the grassy top of the chemin de ronde. I walked along it to the gate tower, looking down into the court which was just below me. Not a human being was in sight, and neither were the dogs. I found a flight of steps in the thickness of the wall and went down them, and when I emerged again into the court, there stood the circle of dogs, the golden-brown one a little ahead of the others, the black greyhound shivering in the rear. "Oh, hang it, you uncomfortable beasts, you!" I exclaimed, my voice startling me with a sudden echo. The dogs stood motionless, watching me. I knew by this time that they would not try to prevent my approaching the house, and the knowledge left me free to examine them. I had a feeling that they must be horribly cowed to be so silent and inert, yet they didn't look hungry or ill-treated. Their coats were smooth, and they were not thin, except the shivering greyhound. It was more as if they had lived a long time with people who never spoke to them or looked at them, as though the silence of the place had gradually benumbed their busy, inquisitive natures. And this strange passivity, this almost human lassitude, seemed to me sadder than the misery of starved and beaten animals. I should have liked to rouse them for a minute, to coax them into a game or a scamper, but the longer I looked into their fixed and weary eyes, the more preposterous the idea became. With the windows of that house looking down on us, how could I have imagined such a thing? The dogs knew better. They knew what the house would tolerate and what it would not. I even fancied that they knew what was passing through my mind and pitied me for my frivolity. But even that feeling probably reached them through a thick fog of listlessness. I had an idea that their distance from me was as nothing to my remoteness from them. The impression they produced was that of having in common one memory so deep and dark that nothing that had happened since was worth either a growl or a wag. "I say," I broke out abruptly, addressing myself to the dumb circle, "do you know what you look like, the whole lot of you? You look as if you'd seen a ghost, that's how you look. I wonder if there is a ghost here, and nobody but you left for it to appear to." The dogs continued to gaze at me, without moving. It was dark when I saw Larivain's motor lamps at the crossroads, and I wasn't exactly sorry to see them. I had the sense of having escaped from the loneliest place in the whole world, and of not liking loneliness to that degree, as much as I had imagined I should. My friend had brought his solicitor back from Quimper for the night, and seated beside a fat and affable stranger, I felt no inclination to talk of Kerfol. But that evening, when Larivain and the solicitor were closeted in the study, Madame de Larivain began to question me in the drawing-room. "Well, are you going to buy Kerfol?" she asked, tilting up her gay chin from her embroidery. "Haven't decided yet. Fact is, I couldn't get into the house," I said, as if I had simply postponed my decision and meant to go back for another look. "You couldn't get in? Why, what's happened? The family are mad to sell the place, and the old guardian has orders." "Very likely, but the old guardian wasn't there." "What a pity. He must have gone to market. But his daughter?" "There was nobody about. At least I saw no one." "How extraordinary. Literally nobody?" "Nobody but a lot of dogs, a whole pack of them, who seem to have the place to themselves." Madame de Larivain let the embroidery slip to her knee and folded her hands on it. For several minutes she looked at me, thoughtfully. "A pack of dogs? You saw them?" "Saw them? I saw nothing else." "How many?" She dropped her voice a little. "I've always wondered." I looked at her with surprise. I had supposed the place to be familiar to her. "Have you never been to Kerfol?" I asked. "Oh, yes, often, but never on that day." "What day?" "I'd quite forgotten, and so had Hervé, I'm sure. If we'd remembered, we never should have sent you today. But then, after all, one doesn't half believe that sort of thing, does one?" "What sort of thing?" I asked, involuntarily sinking my voice to the level of hers. Inwardly, I was thinking, I knew there was something. Madame de Larivain cleared her throat and produced a reassuring smile. "Didn't Hervé tell you the story of Kerfol? An ancestor of his was mixed up in it. You know, every Breton house has its ghost story, and some of them are rather unpleasant." "Yes, but those dogs—" "Well, those dogs are the ghosts of Kerfol. At least the peasants say there's one day in the year when a lot of dogs appear there, and that day the keeper and his daughter go off to Morlaix and get drunk. The women in Brittany drink dreadfully." She stooped to match a silk. Then she lifted her charming, inquisitive Parisian face. "Did you really see a lot of dogs?" "There isn't one at Kerfol," she said. 2. Larivain the next day hunted out a shabby calf volume from the back of an upper shelf of his library. "Yes, here it is. What does it call itself? A History of the Assizes of the Duchy of Brittany, Quimper, 1702. The book was written about 100 years later than the Kerfol affair, but I believe the account is transcribed pretty literally from the judicial records. Anyhow, it's a queer reading. And there's a Hervé de Larivain mixed up in it. Not exactly my style, as you'll see, but then he's only a collateral. Here, take the book up to bed with you. I don't exactly remember the details, but after you've read it, I'll bet anything you'll leave your light burning all night." I left my light burning all night, as he had predicted, but it was chiefly because, till near dawn, I was absorbed in my reading. The account of the trial of Anne de Corno, wife of the Lord of Kerfol, was long and closely printed. It was, as my friend had said, probably an almost literal transcription of what took place in the courtroom, and the trial lasted nearly a month. Besides, the type of the book was very bad. At first I thought of translating the old record, but it's full of wearisome repetitions, and the main lines of the story are forever straying off into side issues. So I've tried to disentangle it and give it here in a simpler form. At times, however, I have reverted to the text because no other words could have conveyed so exactly the sense of what I felt at Kerfol, and nowhere have I added anything of my own. 3. It was a year 16 that Yves de Corno, lord of the domain of Kerfol, went to the pardon of Laran to perform his religious duties. He was a rich and powerful noble, then in his 62nd year, but hale and sturdy, a great horseman and hunter, and a pious man. so all his neighbours attested. In appearance he was short and broad, with a swarthy face, legs slightly bowed from the saddle, a hanging nose, and broad hands with black hairs on them. He had married young and lost his wife and son soon after, and since then had lived alone at Kerfol. Twice a year he went to Morlaix, where he had a handsome house by the river, and spent a week or 10 days there. And occasionally he rode to Rennes on business. Witnesses were found to declare that during these absences he led a life different from the one he was known to lead at Kerfol, where he busied himself with his estate, attended mass daily, and found his only amusement in hunting the wild boar and waterfowl. But these rumours are not particularly relevant, and it is certain that among people of his own class in the neighbourhood he passed for a stern and even austere man, observant of his religious obligations and keeping strictly to himself. There was no talk of any familiarity with the women on his estate, though at that time the nobility were very free with their peasants. Some people said he had never looked at a woman since his wife's death, but such things are hard to prove, and the evidence on this point was not worth much. Well, in his 62nd year, Yves de Corno went to the Pardon at Laran and saw there a young lady of Douarnenez who had ridden over pillion behind her father to do her duty to the saint. Her name was Anne de Barrigan, and she came of good old Breton stock, but much less great and powerful than that of Yves de Corno. And her father had squandered his fortune at cards, and lived almost like a peasant in his little granite manor on the moors. I have said I would add nothing of my own to this bold statement of a strange case, but I must interrupt myself here to describe the young lady who rode up to the lich gate of Le Cronan, at the very moment when the Baron de Corno was also dismounting there. I take my description from a faded drawing in red crayon, sober and truthful enough to be by a late pupil of de Clouet, which hangs in Larivin's study and is said to be a portrait of Anne de Barrigan. It is unsigned and has no mark of identity, but the initials A.B. and the date 16, the year after her marriage. It represents a young woman with a small oval face, almost pointed, yet wide enough for a full mouth, with a tender depression at the corners. The nose is small, and the eyebrows are set rather high, far apart, and as lightly pencilled as the eyebrows in a Chinese painting. The forehead is high and serious, and the hair, which one feels to be fine and thick and fair, is drawn off it and lies close, like a cap. The eyes are neither large nor small, hazel probably, with a look at once shy and steady. A pair of beautiful long hands are crossed below the lady's breast. The chaplain of Kerfol and other witnesses averred that when the Baron came back from Le Cronan, he jumped from his horse, ordered another to be instantly saddled, called to a young page to come with him, and rode away that same evening to the south. His steward followed the next morning with coffers laden on a pair of pack mules. The following week Yves de Corno rode back to Kerfol, sent for his vassals and tenants, and told them he was to be married at All Saints to Anne de Barrigan of Douarnenez, and on All Saints' Day the marriage took place. As to the next few years, the evidence on both sides seemed to show that they passed happily for the couple. No one was found to say that Yves de Corno had been unkind to his wife, and it was plain to all that he was content with his bargain. Indeed, it was admitted by the chaplain and other witnesses for the prosecution that the young lady had a softening influence on her husband, and that he became less exacting with his tenants, less harsh to peasants and dependents, and less subject to the fits of gloomy silence which had darkened his widowhood. As to his wife, the only grievance her champions could call up in her behalf was that Kerfol was a lonely place, and that when her husband was away on business at Rennes or Morlaix, whither she was never taken, she was not allowed as much as to walk in the park unaccompanied. But no one asserted that she was unhappy, though one servant woman said she had surprised her crying, and had heard her say that she was a woman accursed to have no child and nothing in life to call her own. But that was a natural enough feeling in a wife attached to her husband, and certainly it must have been a great relief to Yves de Corno that she bore no son. Yet he never made her feel her childlessness as a reproach. She admits this in her evidence, but seemed to try to make her forget it by showering gifts and favours on her. Rich though he was, He had never been open-handed, but nothing was too fine for his wife in the way of silks or gems or linen or whatever else she fancied. Every wandering merchant was welcome at Kerfol, and when the master was called away he never came back without bringing his wife a handsome present, something curious and particular from Morlaix or Rennes or Quimper. One of the waiting women gave, in cross-examination, an interesting list of 1 year's gifts, which I copy. From Morlaix, a carved ivory junk with Chinamen at the oars, that a strange sailor had brought back as a votive offering for Notre-Dame de la Clarté, above Ploumanach. From Quimper, an embroidered gown worked by the nuns for the Assumption. From Rennes, a silver rose that opened and showed an amber virgin with a crown of garnets. From Morlaix again, a length of Damascus velvet, shot with gold, bought of a Jew from Syria. And for Michaelmas, that same year, from Rennes, a necklet or bracelet of round stones, emeralds and pearls and rubies, strung like beads on a fine gold chain. This was the present that pleased the lady best, the woman said. Later on, as it happened, it was produced at the trial, and appears to have struck the judges and the public as a curious and valuable jewel. The very same winter the Baron absented himself again, this time as far as Bordeaux, and on his return he brought his wife something even odder and prettier than the bracelet. It was a winter evening when he rode up to Kerfol, and walking into the hall found her sitting by the hearth, her chin on her hand, looking into the fire. He carried a velvet box in his hand, and setting it down, lifted the lid, and let out a little golden-brown dog. Anne de Corno exclaimed with pleasure as the little creature bounded toward her. "Oh, it looks like a bird or a butterfly," she cried as she picked it up, and the dog put its paws on her shoulders and looked at her with eyes like a Christian's. After that she would never have it out of her sight, and petted and talked to it as if it had been a child, as indeed it was the nearest thing to a child she was to know. Yves de Corno was much pleased with his purchase. The dog had been brought to him by a sailor from an East India merchantman, and the sailor had bought it of a pilgrim in a bazaar in Jaffa, who had stolen it from a nobleman's wife in China, a perfectly permissible thing to do, since the pilgrim was a Christian and the nobleman a heathen doomed to hellfire. Yves de Corno had paid a long price for the dog, for they were beginning to be in demand at the French court, and the sailor knew he had got hold of a good thing. But Anne's pleasure was so great that to see her laugh and play with the little animal, her husband would doubtless have given twice the sum. So far, all the evidence is at one and the narrative plain sailing, but now the steering becomes difficult. I will try to keep as nearly as possible to Anne's own statements, though toward the end, the poor thing. Well, to go back. The very year after the little brown dog was brought to Kerfol, Yves de Corno, one winter night, was found dead at the head of a narrow flight of stairs leading down from his wife's rooms to a door opening on the court. It was his wife who found him and gave the alarm, so distracted, poor wretch, with fear and horror, for his blood was all over her, that at first the roused household could not make out what she was saying, and thought she'd suddenly gone mad. But there, sure enough, at the top of the stairs lay her husband, stone dead and head foremost, the blood from his wounds dripping down to the steps below him. He had been dreadfully scratched and gashed about the face and throat, as if with curious pointed weapons, and one of his legs had a deep tear in it, which had cut an artery and probably caused his death. But how did he come there, and who had murdered him? His wife declared that she had been asleep in her bed, and hearing his cry had rushed out to find him lying on the stairs, but this was immediately questioned. In the first place, it was proved that from her room she could not have heard the struggle on the stairs, owing to the thickness of the walls and the length of the intervening passage. Then it was evident that she had not been in bed and asleep, since she was dressed when she roused the house, and her bed had not been slept in. Moreover, the door at the bottom of the stairs was ajar, and it was noticed by the chaplain, an observant man, that the dress she wore was stained with blood about the knees, and that there were traces of small blood-stained hands low down on the staircase walls, so that it was conjectured that she had really been at the postern door when her husband fell, and feeling her way up to him in the darkness on her hands and knees, had been stained by his blood dripping down on her. Of course, it was argued on the other side that the blood marks on her dress might have been caused by her kneeling down by her husband when she rushed out of her room, but there was the open door below, and the fact that the finger marks in the staircase all pointed upward. The accused held to her statement for the first 2 days, in spite of its improbability. But on the 3rd day, word was brought to her that Hervé de Lanrivain, a young nobleman of the neighbourhood, had been arrested for complicity in the crime. 2 or 3 witnesses thereupon came forward to say that it was known throughout the country that Lanrivain had formerly been on good terms with the lady of Corno, but that he had been absent from Brittany for over a year, and people had ceased to associate their names. The witnesses who made this statement were not of a very reputable sort. One was an old herb gatherer suspected of witchcraft, another a drunken clerk from a neighbouring parish, the third a half-witted shepherd who could be made to say anything, and it was clear that the prosecution was not satisfied with its case and would have liked to find more definite proof of Lanrivain's complicity than the statement of the herb gatherer, who swore to having seen him climbing the wall of the park on the night of the murder. One way of patching out incomplete proofs in those days was to put some sort of pressure, moral or physical, on the accused person. It is not clear what pressure was put on Anne de Corno, but on the 3rd day, when she was brought in court, she appeared weak and wandering. And after being encouraged to collect herself and speak the truth on her honour and the wounds of her blessed Redeemer, she confessed that she had in fact gone down the stairs to speak with Hervé de Lanrivain, who denied everything, and had been surprised there by the sound of her husband's fall. That was better, and the prosecution rubbed its hands with satisfaction. The satisfaction increased when various dependents living at Kerfol were induced to say, with apparent sincerity, that during the year or 2 preceding his death, their master had once more grown uncertain and irascible, and subject to the fits of brooding silence which his household had learned to dread before his 2nd marriage. This seemed to show that things had not been going well at Kerfol, though no one could be found to say that there had been any signs of open disagreement between husband and wife. Anne de Corno, when questioned as to her reason for going down at night to open the door to Hervé de Lanrivain, made an answer which must have sent a smile round the court. She said it was because she was lonely and wanted to talk with the young man. Was this the only reason? She was asked, and replied, Yes, by the cross over your lordship's heads. But why at midnight? The court asked. Because I could see him in no other way. I can see the exchange of glances across the ermine collars under the crucifix. Anne de Corno, further questioned, said that her married life had been extremely lonely. Desolate was the word she used. It was true that her husband seldom spoke harshly to her, but there were days when he didn't speak at all. It was true that he had never struck or threatened her, but he kept her like a prisoner at Kerfol, and when he rode away to Morlaix or Quimper or Rennes, he set so close a watch on her that she couldn't pick a flower in the garden without having a waiting woman at her heels. I am no queen to need such honours, she once said to him, and he had answered that a man who has a treasure does not leave the key in the lock when he goes out. Then take me with you, she urged. But to this he said that towns were pernicious places, and young wives better off at their own firesides. But what did you want to say to Hervé de Lanrivain? The court asked, and she answered, to ask him to take me away. Ah, you confess that you went down to him with adulterous thoughts? No. Then why did you want him to take you away? Because I was afraid for my life. Of whom were you afraid? Of my husband. Why were you afraid of your husband? Because he had strangled my little dog. Another smile must have passed around the courtroom in days when any nobleman had the right to hang his peasants, and most of them exercised it. Pinching a pet animal's windpipe was nothing to make a fuss about. At this point, one of the judges, who appears to have had a certain sympathy for the accused, suggested that she should be allowed to explain herself in her own way, and she thereupon made the following statement. The first years of her marriage had been lonely, but her husband had not been unkind to her. If she had had a child, she would not have been unhappy, but the days were long and it rained too much. It was true that her husband, whenever he went away and left her, brought her a handsome present on his return, but this did not make up for the loneliness. At least nothing had, till he brought her the little brown dog from the East. After that she was much less unhappy. Her husband seemed pleased that she was so fond of the dog. He gave her leave to put her jewelled bracelet around its neck and to keep it always with her. One day she had fallen asleep in her room with the dog at her feet, as his habit was. Her feet were bare and resting on his back. Suddenly she was waked by her husband. He stood beside her, smiling not unkindly. "You look like my great-grandmother, Juliane de Corno, lying in the chapel with her feet on a little dog," he said. The analogy sent a chill through her, but she laughed and answered, "Well, when I'm dead you must put me beside her, carved in marble, with my dog at my feet." "Oh, we'll wait and see," he said, laughing also, but with his black brows close together. "The dog is the emblem of fidelity." "And do you doubt my right to lie with mine at my feet?" "When I'm in doubt, I find out," he answered. "I'm an old man," he added, "and people say I make you lead a lonely life. But I swear you shall have your monument, if you earn it." "And I swear to be faithful," she returned, "if only for the sake of having my little dog at my feet." Not long afterward he went on business to the Quimper Assizes, and while he was away his aunt, the widow of a great nobleman of the duchy, came to spend a night at Kerfol, on her way to the pardon of Sainte Barbe. She was a woman of piety and consequence, and much respected by Yves de Corno. But when she proposed to Anne to go with her to Sainte Barbe, no one could object, and even the chaplain declared himself in favour of the pilgrimage. So Anne set out for Sainte Barbe, and there, for the first time, she talked with Hervé de Larrivain. He had come once or twice to Kerfol with his father, but she had never before exchanged a dozen words with him. They didn't talk for more than 5 minutes now. It was under the chestnuts, as the procession was coming out of the chapel. He said, "I pity you," and she was surprised, for she had not supposed that anyone thought her an object of pity. He added, "Call for me when you need me," and she smiled a little, but was glad afterward, and thought often of the meeting. She confessed to having seen him 3 times afterward, not more. How or where she wouldn't say. One had the impression that she feared to implicate someone. Their meetings had been rare and brief, and at the last he had told her that he was starting the next day for a foreign country, on a mission which was not without peril and might keep him for many months absent. He asked her for a remembrance, and she had none to give him but the collar about the little dog's neck. She was sorry afterward that she had given it, but he was so unhappy at going that she had not the courage to refuse. Her husband was away at the time. When he returned a few days later, he picked up the animal to pet it and noticed that its collar was missing. His wife told him that the dog had lost it in the undergrowth of the park, and that she and her maids had hunted a whole day for it. It was true, she explained to the court, that she had made the maids search for the necklet. They all believed the dog had lost it in the park. Her husband made no comment, and that evening at supper he was in his usual mood, between good and bad. You could never tell which. He talked a good deal, describing what he'd seen and done in Rennes, but now and then he stopped and looked hard at her. And when she went to bed she found a little dog strangled on a pillow. The little thing was dead, but still warm. She stooped to lift it, and her distress turned to horror when she discovered that it had been strangled by twisting twice round its throat the necklet she had given to Larrivain. The next morning at dawn she buried the dog in the garden and hid the necklet in her breast. She said nothing to her husband then or later, and he said nothing to her, but that day he had a peasant hanged for stealing a faggot in the park, and the next day he nearly beat to death a young horse he was breaking. Winter set in, and the short days passed, and the long nights one by one, and she heard nothing of Hervé de Larrivain. It might be that her husband had killed him, or merely that he had been robbed of the necklet. Day after day by the hearth, among the spinning maids. Night after night, alone on her bed, she wondered and trembled. Sometimes at table her husband looked across at her and smiled, and then she felt sure that Laran was dead. She dared not try to get news of him, for she was sure her husband would find out if she did. She had an idea that he could find out anything. Even when a witch woman who was a noted seer and could show you the whole world in her crystal came to the castle for a night's shelter and the maids flocked to her, Anne held back. The winter was long and black and rainy. One day, in Yves de Corno's absence, some gypsies came to Kerfol with a troop of performing dogs. Anne bought the smallest and cleverest, a white dog with a feathery coat and one blue and one brown eye. It seemed to have been ill-treated by the gypsies and clung to her plaintively when she took it from them. That evening her husband came back, and when she went to bed, she found the dog strangled on her pillow. After that she said to herself that she would never have another dog, but one bitter cold evening a poor lean greyhound was found whining at the castle gate, and she took him in and forbade the maids to speak of him to her husband. She hid him in a room that no one went to, and smuggled food to him from her own plate, made him a warm bed to lie on, and petted him like a child. Yves de Corno came home, and the next day she found the greyhound strangled on her pillow. She wept in secret, but said nothing, and resolved that even if she met a dog dying of hunger, she would never bring him into the castle. But one day she found a young sheepdog, a brindled puppy with good blue eyes, lying with a broken leg in the snow of the park. Yves de Corno was at Rennes, and she brought the dog in, warmed and fed it, tied up its leg and hid it in the castle till her husband's return. The day before, she gave it to a peasant woman who lived a long way off, and paid her handsomely to care for it and say nothing. But that night she heard a whining and scratching at her door, and when she opened it, the lame puppy, drenched and shivering, jumped up on her with little sobbing barks. She hid him in her bed, and the next morning was about to have him taken back to the peasant woman, when she heard her husband ride into the court. She shut the dog in a chest and went down to receive him. An hour or two later, when she returned to her room, the puppy lay strangled on her pillow. After that, she dared not make a pet of any other dog, and her loneliness became almost unendurable. Sometimes when she crossed the court of the castle and thought no one was looking, she stopped to pat the old pointer at the gate. But one day, as she was caressing him, her husband came out of the chapel, and the next day the old dog was gone. This curious narrative was not told in one sitting of the court, or received without impatience and incredulous comment. It was plain that the judges were surprised by its puerility, and that it didn't help the accused in the eyes of the public. It was an odd tale, certainly, but what did it prove? That Yves de Corno disliked dogs, and that his wife, to gratify her own fancy, persistently ignored this dislike. As for pleading this trivial disagreement as an excuse for her relations, whatever their nature, with her supposed accomplice, the argument was so absurd that her own lawyer manifestly regretted having let her make use of it, and tried several times to cut short her story. But she went on to the end, with a kind of hypnotized insistence, as though the scenes she evoked were so real to her that she had forgotten where she was and imagined herself to be reliving them. At length, the judge, who had previously shown a certain kindness to her, said, leaning forward a little, one may suppose, from his row of dozing colleagues, "Then you would have us believe that you murdered your husband because he would not let you keep a pet dog." "I did not murder my husband." "Who did then? Hervé de Lanrivain?" "No." "Who then? Can you tell us?" "Yes, I can tell you. The dogs." At that point she was carried out of the court in a swoon. It was evident that her lawyer tried to get her to abandon this line of defence. Possibly her explanation, whatever it was, had seemed convincing when she poured it out to him in the heat of their first private colloquy, but now that she was exposed to the cold daylight of judicial scrutiny and the banter of the town, he was thoroughly ashamed of it, and would have sacrificed her without a scruple to save his professional reputation. But the obstinate judge, who, perhaps after all, was more inquisitive than kindly, evidently wanted to hear the story out, and she was ordered the next day to continue her deposition. She said that after the disappearance of the old watchdog, nothing particular happened for a month or two. Her husband was much as usual. She didn't remember any special incident. But one evening a peddler woman came to the castle and was selling trinkets to the maids. She had no heart for trinkets, but she stood looking on while the women made their choice, and then, she didn't know how, but the peddler coaxed her into buying for herself a pear-shaped pomander with a strong scent in it. She had once seen something of the kind on a gypsy woman. She had no desire for the pomander and didn't know why she'd bought it. The peddler said that whoever wore it had the power to read the future, but she didn't really believe that, or care much either. However, she bought the thing and took it up to her room, where she sat, turning it about in her hand. Then the strange scent attracted her, and she began to wonder what kind of spice was in the box. She opened it and found a grey bean rolled in a strip of paper, and on the paper she saw a sign she knew, and a message from Hervé de Larrivain, saying that he was at home again, and would be at the door in the court that night after the moon had set. She burned the paper and sat down to think. It was nightfall, and her husband was at home. She had no way of warning Larrivain, and there was nothing to do but wait. At this point I fancy the drowsy courtroom beginning to wake up. Even to the oldest hand on the bench there must have been a certain relish in picturing the feelings of a woman on receiving such a message at nightfall from a man living 20 miles away, to whom she had no means of sending a warning. She was not a clever woman, I imagine, and as the first result of her cogitation she appears to have made the mistake of being, that evening, too kind to her husband. She couldn't ply him with wine according to the traditional expedient, for though he drank heavily at times, he had a strong head, and when he drank beyond its strength it was because he chose to, and not because a woman coaxed him, not his wife at any rate. She was an old story by now. As I read the case, I fancy there was no feeling for her left in him but the hatred occasioned by his supposed dishonour. At any rate, she tried to call up her old graces, but early in the evening he complained of pains and fever and left the hall to go up to the closet where he sometimes slept. His servant carried him a cup of hot wine and brought back word that he was sleeping and not to be disturbed, and an hour later, when Anne lifted the tapestry and listened at his door, she heard his loud, regular breathing. She thought it might be a faint, and stayed a long time barefooted in a passage, her ear to the crack, but the breathing went on too steadily and naturally to be other than that of a man in a sound sleep. She crept back to her room reassured, and stood in the window, watching the moon set through the trees of the park. The sky was misty and starless, and after the moon went down the night was as black as pitch. She knew the time had come, and stole along the passage, past her husband's door, where she stopped again to listen to his breathing, to the top of the stairs. There she paused a moment and assured herself that no one was following her. Then she began to go down the stairs into the darkness. They were so steep and winding that she had to go very slowly for fear of stumbling. Her one thought was to get the door unbolted, tell Larrivain to make his escape, and hasten back to her room. She had tried the bolt earlier in the evening and managed to put a little grease on it, but nevertheless when she drew it, it gave a squeak, not loud, but it made her heart stop, and the next minute overhead she heard a noise. "What noise?" the prosecution interposed. "My husband's voice, calling out my name and cursing me." "What did you hear after that?" "A terrible scream and a fall." "Where was Hervé de Larrivain at this time?" "He was standing outside in the court. I just made him out in the darkness. I told him for God's sake to go, and then I pushed the door shut." "What did you do next?" "I stood at the foot of the stairs and listened." "What did you hear?" "I heard dogs, snarling and panting, visible discouragement of the bench, boredom of the public, and exasperation of the lawyer for the defence. Dogs again. But the inquisitive judge insisted." "What dogs?" She bent her head and spoke so low that she had to be told to repeat her answer. I don't know. How do you mean you don't know? I don't know. What dogs? The judge again intervened. Try to tell us exactly what happened. How long did you remain at the foot of the stairs? Only a few minutes. And what was going on meanwhile overhead? The dogs kept on snarling and panting. Once or twice he cried out. I think he moaned once. Then he was quiet. Then what happened? Then I heard a sound like the noise of a pack when the wolf is thrown to them, gulping and lapping. There was a groan of disgust and repulsion through the court, and another attempted intervention by the distracted lawyer, but the inquisitive judge was still inquisitive. And all the while you did not go up? Yes, I went up then to drive them off. The dogs? Yes. Well, when I got there it was quite dark. I found my husband's flint and steel and struck a spark. I saw him lying there. He was dead. And the dogs? The dogs were gone. Gone? Where to? I don't know. There was no way out, and there are no dogs at Kerfol. She straightened herself to her full height, threw her arms above her head, and fell down on the stone floor with a long scream. There was a moment of confusion in the courtroom. Someone on the bench was heard to say, "This is clearly a case for the ecclesiastical authorities." And the prisoner's lawyer doubtless jumped at the suggestion. After this, the trial loses itself in a maze of cross-questioning and squabbling. Every witness who was called corroborated Anne de Corno's statement that there were no dogs at Kerfol, and had been none for several months. The master of the house had taken quite a dislike to dogs. There was no denying it. But on the other hand, at the inquest, there had been a long and bitter discussion as to the nature of the dead man's wounds. One of the surgeons called in had spoken of marks that looked like bites. The suggestion of witchcraft was revived, and the opposing lawyers hurled tomes of necromancy at each other. At last Anne de Corno was brought back into court at the instance of the same judge, and asked if she knew where the dog she spoke of could have come from. On the body of her Redeemer she swore that she did not. Then the judge put his final question. If the dogs you think you heard had been known to you, do you think you would have recognized them by their barking? Yes. Did you recognize them? Yes. What dogs do you take them to have been? My dead dogs, she said in a whisper. She was taken out of court, not to reappear there again. There was some kind of ecclesiastical investigation, and the end of the business was that the judges disagreed with each other and with the ecclesiastical committee, and that Anne de Corno was finally handed over to the keeping of her husband's family, who shut her up in the keep of Kerfol, where she is said to have died many years later, a harmless madwoman. So ends the story. As for that of Hervé de Lanrivain, I had only to apply to his collateral descendant for its subsequent details. The evidence against the young man being insufficient and his family influence in the duchy considerable, he was set free and left soon afterwards for Paris. He was probably in no mood for a worldly life, and he appears to have come almost immediately under the influence of the famous Monsieur Arnaud de Andilly and the gentlemen of Port Royal. A year or two later he was received into their order, and, without achieving any particular distinction, he followed its good and evil fortunes till his death some 20 years later. Lanrivain showed me a portrait of him by a pupil of Philippe de Champaigne, sad eyes, an impulsive mouth, and a narrow brow. Poor Hervé de Lanrivain! It was a grey ending. Yet, as I looked at his stiff and sallow effigy, in the dark dress of the Jansenists, I almost found myself envying his fate. After all, in the course of his life, two great things had happened to him. He had loved romantically, and he must have talked with Pascal.
You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads. You can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud.
So that was Kerfol by Edith Wharton, published in 1916 while the First World War was raging on in France. She lived in France a lot. Now, at that time, yeah. Now, a couple of things to say, mainly to preempt comments that will vex me. And I know from experience that the people who make these comments don't actually listen to this bit. So, but anyway, in the futility of it all, I'm still going to say, Edith Wharton was a dog lover. She had dogs all the time. So no dogs were injured during this story because it's a piece of fiction. And I know people will comment on this, but she loved dogs. And I remember writing a story where a dog died, and somebody wrote, Tony Walker obviously hates dogs. Oh, absolutely untrue. My life is dogs. My life is dogs, like Edith Wharton's was. Now, one must reflect that the purpose of dogs in ghost and horror stories seems only to die. At least they came back as ghosts. Whereas the purpose of cats, as I've talked about elsewhere in the Chippendale Mirror by E.F. Benson, that cats don't fare as badly in horror stories as dogs do. Dogs have a bad time in horror and ghost stories. So the first thing is that. The second thing is a faggot. A faggot is a small stick typically used for firewood. So hence the British slang, a fag for a cigarette, is a shortening of a faggot, a burning stick, because somebody will comment on that word as well. And what the third thing is my use of R in Kerfol, Kerfol, Kerfol. So a French uvula R, a tapped R, or a rhotic British English, non-rhotic British English. So I didn't say Kerfol, I don't think. Kerfol, I didn't do that either. So what is my justification? Well, I quite like the French language, but my heart goes to the Breton. So I'm learning Cornish at the moment. I've done a bit of Breton in the past. I'm going to learn Breton properly afterwards. So I am inclining to the Breton. Now, the older R in Breton was a tapped, and you can still hear it if you go on the internet and you listen to some of the older Breton speakers. And in different dialects, it's still prevalent. But of course, with the younger people, it's become more the French R. So Kerfol. So I've varied between that. Now, after those 3 points about faggots, dogs, and R's, I'm going to tell you about Edith Wharton. So in the 6 years that I've been doing this now into our 6th calendar year anyway, we've done a few Edith Wharton stories, and one of the things that strikes me about Edith, if I may, is that her voice is so different in all the stories. I mean, you think of Mr. Jones, think of The Pomegranate Seed, Bewitched, The House of the Dead Hand. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're all really different, and this is also and Afterward, and this is similar. This feels a bit more like Afterward. Anyway, let me say something about her life. We've done a bit about her. My point being, I'm going to tell you again about her. So if you know, just hum to yourself or something. So anyway, she was born in 1862. Edith Newbold Wharton, born Edith Jones, in New York City, and her family was very, very wealthy. And it is them, if you didn't know, that gave rise to the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. Those were the Joneses. You had to keep up. So the upper class New York society. Her family didn't really want her to write, but she was, I think if you write, you write, you can't help it. She published her first book of poetry at the age of 16, and then in her late 30s she began writing in earnest, particularly critiquing and portraying the Gilded Age people of the American Northeast, the wealthy. And she was a big pal of Henry James. We did a Henry James last week. We did the Jolly Corner. And in terms of writing, James has a lot to be said for him. But in terms of actually the writing and the pleasure of narrating it, I'd narrate 100 Edith Wharton stories for every one of Henry James's. I think I really like her writing. So famous for Ethan Frome. If he was from Somerset, they call him Ethan Froome. In 1911, The Age of Innocence, The House of Mirth. So a lot of these are critiques of the top draw people. She spent a lot of time in England, which is why a number of her stories like Mr. Jones and Afterward are actually set in England. And this one's set in France, or technically in Brittany. We could have a political argument about that. But I don't propose that we do. So, and she lived a long time in France as well, particularly during the First World War. So while she wrote this, she was living in France when this was written, I think. And she did a lot of work for the French war effort. She stayed in Paris doing humanitarian stuff, establishing workrooms for unemployed seamstresses, convalescent homes for tuberculosis patients, and schools for Belgian refugee children. Remember, Belgium had been invaded by the Germans, and so they fled. Her dedication to the war effort earned her the French Legion of Honor, which she was given in 1916, the year that this story was published. Despite all that, and her genius as a writer, and her success as a writer, and her wealth, she had troubles. And her great humanitarian work, she had troubles. She was married to Edith Teddy Wharton, and he was a trust fund baby. Like lots of them, like Henry James writes about. And she was an aesthete and an intellectual and a humanitarian, and I think he wasn't any of those things. And he spent most of her money. He was financially irresponsible. In 1911, he told her he'd spent most of her money. He suffered from acute depression, and may have had bipolar disorder. These psychiatric diagnoses are so flexible. There are no tests for them. They're just clinical opinions. So whatever mental health and emotional problems you have may vary according to which doctor you spoke to, or even be self-diagnosed. It was very hard to pin it down. So did he have bipolar? Who knows? He could have had what we would call a personality disorder. And that changes as well. And, personality disorders still exist, but increasingly being called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So the name's changed, nomenclature changes, the opinions of what you've got. And as long as there's no blood test or imaging test for them, who knows? Anyway, he was emotionally and mentally unstable, financially ruined her. Well, he didn't, but he spent a lot of her money. She had a lot of money, but he spent a lot of it. He was also unfaithful, and she seemed such a nice lady. So he just wanted to play sports and outdoors, and she was an intellectual. So they were totally mismatched, really. By the end of their marriage, she was with him for 28 years, but by the end of that, somebody described him, I haven't got a origin of the quote here, as completely mentally unhinged. Afterwards, he moved back to the US, to Lennox. That's how you'd say if it was in Scotland. And she moved permanently to France. She wrote about a book a year for the rest of her life. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1996. She was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate from Yale University. Her work continues to be celebrated, as rightly so, I think. She passed away in August 1937, in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, near Paris, leaving behind a legacy as one of the major American novelists and short story writers of the 20th century. And I think that's right, So, I'm very fond of Edith Wharton. I didn't know her personally, but I think I would have been. It's worth saying that she was a big dog lover. And, of course, there are no human ghosts in this story, only the ghost of dogs in this story, Kerfol. So she wrote in a diary entry, I am secretly afraid of animals, of all animals except dogs, and even of some dogs. I think it is because of the usness in their eyes, with the underlying not usness which belies it, and is so tragic a reminder of the lost age when we human beings branched off and left them to eternal inarticulateness and slavery. Why, their eyes seem to ask us. I'm not sure I would agree with her on that, but certainly she loved dogs all her life, with many of them buried in a pet cemetery at her home, and was a charter member of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. When her last dog, Linky, died, Wharton passed away 4 months after. Kerfol, yeah, it has cruelty to dogs in it. And actually, it makes me ponder on what this Classic Ghost Stories channel is about, because we cover it's called Classic Ghost Stories channel, and apart from my own stories, we cover a wide range of authors in time and times from, probably the earliest one is E.T.A. Hoffman's stuff. Maybe there's some earlier, late 18th century stories I've done, right up to sort of mid 20th century authors. And they vary in tone from cozy ghost stories, humorous ghost stories, to quite horrific stories in some cases. And what I would say is that this type of literature, stories, is intended. It's dark. It is dark, If we wanted to do a comic stories channel, we wouldn't expect it to be dark at all, would we? If you come to a ghost stroke horror, we're going to be dipping our toes in darkness. And so I think you need to expect that and not be too... If this is stuff that you can't stomach, I mean, these stories are cruel to people, they're cruel to other animals, they're cruel to all sorts of people, they're cruel to children, they're cruel to old people. This is their nature. This is darkness. This is what we're wading through a little bit, even if it is cozy. And the funny thing about the channel is that people use it to go to sleep, and they do find these stories cozy. And I would, even I notice a difference between, say, 80s slasher gore, where it's all about dismemberment and vileness, and particularly the later horror stories, which I don't do, which have sexual vileness in as well. And that is not to my taste. So I don't know what I'm saying there, really. I'm saying, I'm not going to put a trigger warning. That's what I'm saying. I'm not going to put a trigger warning that these stories contain dark things, because that is the nature of the channel. If you eat a piece of dark chocolate, it's going to taste like dark chocolate. If you don't like dark chocolate, don't pick it up. Yeah. And so that's as far as the trigger warning goes. The trigger warning is in the title, Classic Ghost Stories, and then you look at it and you see it's about ghosts, monsters, horror. It's dark. So don't be affronted when it is dark, because that's what it is. And you should know that. Anyway, rant over. Let's look at the structure. So it is a frame story, and this is really common in this period. Think of The Turn of the Screw, classic example of its period. It starts by somebody recounting the story. So we have a modern bit, and that frames it. It is slightly unusual in that with a frame story, very often the person begins by recounting something that has happened to them or somebody else, and that is at one remove. So they are talking about something that has happened in the past and is no longer, and they're not involved in it. Whereas this frame, if frame it is a kind of frame, is the person themselves. He goes and see Kerfol, and at the end there's the tiniest touch of a frame just to seal it up, I think. Whereas most frame stories have usually a balanced beginning and an end, which the introduction, then the story itself, then the second part of the frame is a wrapping up, in some senses, yeah. So it was really common for ghost stories to be in that structure. The difference is that this sort of isn't quite a true frame, because the protagonist gets involved. It's clearly a story with strong gothic elements. So if we think about the gothic elements we find here are revenge, family problems, the very 18th century. Certainly the historical document feels like something going back to the 1790s or even early 1760s. The kind of thing that they were writing then about revenge and family problems. I've said all this, but you know what I'm saying. In this very gothic, it rains all the time, and it is completely gothic. We have the building itself very classically gothic. So after saying that and not labouring it, the first part I think is very simple. So we have this person who we don't really know, but is a bit of a loner, and so the person called Hervé Lanrivain, who's the same name as the guy in the story, interestingly, his ancestor of some kind. He says, and he just drops this person on the heath, the moor, and they walk alone to this Gothic ruin, this half ruin. And it seems to me that Wharton succeeds extremely well in the creation of the atmosphere of just walking up to it, almost like a cinematic long shot. You know, the establishing shots you get at the very beginning of some films, whereby we see, particularly in Gothic films, often you'll have Castle Dracula or Frankenstein's laboratory, and we'll see it. I think also Nosferatu, the 2024 Eggers Nosferatu film, did this as well. So we see the castle as an establishing shot, and in fact the port of Visburg, isn't it, in Nosferatu, and it is just very cinematic almost. Except in this, we have the benefit of the emotions and the impressions of the observer. So that's where it is kind of different to a camera, and more intimate, I think, because we're involved in it through the protagonist. So, but I think all we're doing is we are approaching over the moor, down the avenue, looking at it, spending some time looking at it from the outside, eventually going in through the door. There's nobody there, and that's very Gothic. That was almost like there's a castle like that in Lady of the House of Love by Angela Carter. You know, the Gothic, that's how you approach the Gothic castle. And in Dracula, in all the various versions of Dracula, particularly the 23 version Nosferatu, he approaches the castle, which appears to be empty, coming to the Gothic building, which appears to be empty, and having to find your own way in it. I mean, we could be very psychoanalytical about that and say, what does that represent? Is it, you know, we are born into this world, into a Gothic castle. We don't know what on earth's going on here. We're a bit worried about it. We're amazed by it as well. And we've got to find our own way around it and negotiate whatever unknown mysteries it holds. We could say that. Or not. And that's that. And then the dogs, of course. And the dogs are like silent witnesses. And of course, they are ghost dogs. We don't know that yet. But they are corporeal dogs. They're not spooky dogs that go through walls and wearing sheets. Funnily enough, Callie came to see me the other day. She was wearing a blanket. I said to Sheila, did you put that blanket on her? And no, she put the blanket on herself and was wandering around wearing a blanket. But anyway, it fell off, obviously. They just ate a golf ball when I came in. Now I've been to the gym, I came back, and there's a golf ball that they'd eaten. Anyway, they're naughty. Dogs. So the dogs are there, and you know, she really did love dogs. Edith Wharton. They were great with her husband. So that's very interesting as well, isn't it? Because whereas we don't know. I mean, we know that her husband Teddy was a spendthrift and an adulterer, and yeah, probably hard to live with. What's the parallel between this and the young Anne de Brannigan? Is she Anne? Yeah. And Yves de Corno. So, yeah, he's moody. He's controlling. There's no sense. I don't know enough about. I haven't read a biography of Edith Wharton. That's one thing I must do. Whether Teddy was controlling or just kind of crap. But you can see that, and lonely, and finding solace in the companion of her dog. Anne is a bit foolish, and as Edith Wharton says, Anne was not clever. Why would you give as a keepsake? I mean, and also the story, her story's a bit mixed up, because first of all, why did you go and answer the door? Well, I was lonely, and she knew it was him, and I just wanted to chat. And then I wanted him to take me away. And then later on, she says she goes down with the express intention of warning him, telling him to git. But so that isn't consistent. But I think that works because I think Wharton's aware of that. I don't think that's an error on the part of the author. I think Wharton is portraying a woman whose story is shifting because she knows the truth is going to be unpalatable. She actually swoons when she tells it, unpalatable to these people whose her death is in their hands, her life is in their hands, and she's going to have to tell them what she knows to be the truth, that the ghost dogs killed her husband, which I believe actually. because of the wounds on his body. I think that there is some view that there's an ambiguity about this, that it's like playing, is she crazy? That old chestnut. Is she crazy? Is it really supernatural, or is it what is it, Scooby-Doo? But I don't think there is much wiggle room there. I think this is clearly supernatural. I mean, it's presented to us with the weird dogs. Let's say something about, very briefly, we can jump back to what else I was saying about how she conjures the supernatural. In this, she is a bit like Henry James. They're not full-on ghost and monsters. It's just intimations of oddness. Like, what are these dogs doing? And that pointer that's just looking at her out the window. I tell you, a lovely little touch was the pot of fuchsias. Just this lovely detail she's got. That's nothing to do with the weirdness, but it's just this how she conjures the scene for you. That the Greeks called that, or the rhetoricians called it enargia or enargia, whereby you conjure a scene for the reader. And therefore you place the reader in the scene, experiencing it all if you do it well, and therefore they have the emotions. That's what you want to do with a story. You want to generate emotions in the reader, listener, as if they were there. And the pot of fuchsias, I mean, if you're ever going to write something, just don't overdo it, but just the odd little detail whereby you go into a certain cup or a certain pair of shoes or a certain cloud, and that, just that one detailed piece plonks somebody in it. It's about focus. I was listening to a YouTube thing about focus, filter theory, whereby, the world, we live in the world, but we're only ever really aware of what we're focusing on. The rest of it might as well not exist. So it's just an experiment now. Think about what you're focusing on. It could be me. It could be something else. Where's your foot? When was the last time you were aware of your feet? Now, if you've got chronic pain in your feet, you maybe were. But in that case, I'd say to you, what about your watch? I'm not going to say, well, if you don't have a watch. But you see what I'm saying? Filter theory. So this enargia theory is that the pot of fuchsias, boom, you're there. Another thing is to say, people talk about blackbirds. Before you actually look, they're just all blackbirds. And then when you kind of get into them, certainly in the UK, and in similar places geographically, you have jackdaws, rooks, carrion crows, actual blackbirds, ravens, and they're all different. Starlings are blackish, and so, but if you don't look, you only see, you don't know. But when you focus, and it's something about human attention that's really special, and if you're writing and if you actually give somebody a focus, it becomes real, and therefore they are in that scene. As a writer, you place them in the scene. I've gone on about this for maybe a bit too long, but she does this really well. I mean, she was top notch, in my view. I really like her. I really like Edith Wharton, if you hadn't realised. So the first part is going up. The second part is like very gothic, as I said. It's very gothic in theme. It's a courtroom drama, isn't it? And of course, the courtroom dramas were coming in detective fiction. I've said this about, and you have to listen to some of the stuff. Oh yeah, I did a Rumpole story, a Rumpole of the Bailey story, which is a courtroom drama. And as a subgenre of detective fiction, courtroom dramas were coming in at this period. So we have a courtroom drama. It reminded me of M.R. James's story, Martin's Close. Now, Martin's Close came out 5 years before this one. So Martin's Close also has a two-part structure, a frame set in the present, his present, and a historical recounting which happens to take place in a courtroom. So they use the modern perspective, both stories, to create an atmosphere of intrigue and foreboding, then delve into a detailed historical explanation that provides context for the supernatural events. So in Martin's Close and in this one, Kerfol, the courtroom explains the ghost, although we didn't know there were ghost dogs. Well, we didn't know. We didn't know until our protagonist goes back and Madame de Larivin says, "Oh, the dogs, you saw the dogs." And then we're like, what? I just thought they were dogs. No. And then we get the penny drops, they are ghost dogs. And then the next part, the historical part, explains why they are. So let's say something else about. So that's the structure. And I think it's similar to M.R. James's Martin's Close came out 5 years earlier. It has elements of the courtroom drama. I think the way she does that back and forward of the cross-examination is really good. I enjoyed narrating that, actually. And yeah, we talked about the gothic nature of Kerfol. Some other themes. So isolation and loneliness. And the Corno trapped in an oppressive and loveless marriage by a really controlling man. Kerfol itself, with sombre architecture and eerie silence, mirrors Anne's internal desolation. Now, interestingly, there was a French philosopher called Gaston Bachelard, and he wrote a book called The Poetics of Space, published in 1958. So this is not, I'm not saying that Kerfol is influenced by this, but it's interesting that they're both French or Breton. He wasn't Breton, I don't think. So Bachelard's his basic idea is that the house and other spaces we inhabit, but particularly houses, they can be understood as frameworks for understanding them as a model of the psyche, with rooms and levels as layers of consciousness, corners, nooks and crannies, the house as memory. And of course, the further we see Kerfol, and he actually distinctly alludes to the fact that the house contains memories of those who've lived and died there. So I think Bachelard, I've got the book, it's really hard to read, it's a hard read, and I haven't finished it, but I love the idea. So I just think that's a way, and you can, if you're really into it and you are smart enough to read and understand his book, you can approach books like The Haunting of Hill House, this one here, Kerfol, The Fall of the House of Usher. You can look at the house through this perspective, and I think you can do your PhD. I reckon you could do your PhD on that one. Anyway, so we talked about the Gothic nature of the house, and we've just really touched on the idea of the house, or the castle in this case, or the fortified manor house, as a model or as a mirror of her psychic state. Yeah, I don't mean psychic in the sense of clairvoyance. I mean mental state, I suppose. The only solace that she has is with her dogs, and we've also touched on this. Maybe is Edith Wharton's experience from her marriage. Power and control on two levels, really. We see his utter coercion and control over. I mean, it's a classic abusive thing, isn't it? He brings a presence, but he doesn't hit her, but he psychologically dominates her. She's not allowed. I mean, if she goes and picks a flower, she has a maid sent with her because he's so jealous and controlling that. I don't even think that's the implication. I think he says that if you keep a treasure, you don't leave the key in the door. So he wants to control his resource, his possession, which is this young wife. He won't let her go anywhere. And of course, when she goes eventually with this posh relative to a pardon, these are in the west of Brittany, these are religious festivals related to saints. They still go on today, and they're a big deal. And so and then she meets this chap, even briefly, but because she's so starved of love, I think it's like a match to Tinder, dry Tinder. And it just, you can imagine setting off a longing for a different life. And it rains all the time, of course. And of course, that's part of the Gothic, but also a reflection of her mental state. Now, I was going to say about the two levels of control, the two aspects of control that this guy, Yves de Corno, employs. First off, on his wife. Secondly, hanging your serfs. So these people belong to you. They were just... what is the difference between them and a slave? They were bound to the land. They weren't allowed to go anywhere else. They had to work for you. And also, if they had time, well, they would have to feed themselves from their own allotted pieces of land. You, as Lord, could kill them when you wanted, and did. And he, nearly killed a young horse as well. It's interesting that the servants, the dogs, the wife, the horse are all possessions of this man, and he can do what he wants with them. So it leads to questions of gender, of course, but I don't think Wharton makes a big deal of the fact that he's a man. He clearly is a man, and it clearly is men that had this power, but I think it's just, she just portrays it as is. So she's not critiquing men qua men, men as men. she is just giving a mirror to it and they go, this is how it was, and it wasn't good. And for the horses, dogs, women, or serfs. So I think that's really interesting, but I don't think she's making a very strong feminist point there, although you could read it that way. You could do your PhD on that as well. So again, and the classic Gothic mechanism, but with a twist. The ghosts are agents of retribution. Great wrong has been done to these creatures and they get their revenge, and their revenge is mirrored in the wife's state. It's almost like the wife would will them to do it. Her love for the dogs and the fact that they pay him back for his cruelty to both her and them, it might be something that she would have wished and willed, although it doesn't work out too well for her because she gets locked up and dies insane in the house. Very Gothic, of course, but so there's no happy ending particularly, is there? The frame allows us to step back from that, because the protagonist in this case, if the protagonist had gone through this, say she'd done away with the two-part story and we'd just had her Anne's life, that would have been a very bleak, hard story. But because it's shown to us through the eyes of somebody who makes no moral comment on it, really, when he's reading this story, he doesn't you can infer it, but he doesn't explicitly, unless I'm missing something, it doesn't make a big deal anyway of the terrible wrongs. I mean, I think he feels for her, but he isn't massively internally affected by it. He's not breaking down in tears or screaming with the injustice of it, is he? The protagonist, he's distanced, and I think that is a kind of like an insulation for us as well. Maybe not for you, but for me, I'm hard as nails anyway. I'm used to all this stuff, so it doesn't scare me or it doesn't work for me, but I think it's really interesting. So I think we may have said all we need to say about it. There's probably a lot more to say. I liked it. People, if you go on Goodreads, don't rate it as one of our best stories, but another thing that Edith Wharton does with her ghost stories, like Bewitched, like Mr. Jones, even to an extent afterward, are not as strong. The Pomegranate Seed, all these stories we've done on the podcast, she typically leaves an ambiguity. So, like M.R. James's, of course, but and then they're contemporaries, but in this, it's not so ambiguous. I don't think she does it, and maybe that's why people say it's not one of her classics. But because it's not so ambiguous, it's perhaps more accessible. It is a ghost story. A terrible wrong was done. The only ghosts are the ghosts of the dogs, but they serve the absolute function of a ghost, of one of the functions of a ghost, which is to exact revenge and to right wrongs, and they do that. Good on them for doing it. So I'm a bit scared about going downstairs. I think mine are asleep, but if they've heard this story, they might think they're gonna get the better of me and slurp on me. I think that was the thing. Anyway, there we are. So yeah, a good story, I thought. Another good one. I like Edith Wharton. I've said that 1,500 times, but it's true. Final thing to say is a lot of people have begged me on their knees to add music. You remember I cut the music for those of you who want to sleep, as a majority of people want the music back. So to please them, here it is.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back? Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back. Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?